So, welcome everyone. I thought, given that normally you start these things by showing some sort of like slick video, which we anyway don't have, but also as we've all been somewhat in isolation, looking at very static scenes, it might be nice just to do a little walk around the studio where we're back for the first time in, well, sort of 11 weeks or something this week, and we've got our little sort of skeleton team here of kind of hardcore. This space is where we tend to experiment with tech projects, and so Vitaly here is doing some experimenting with a little AR app project which we've been focusing on during the lockdown. This is our guinea pig for VR projects. I'm fortunate to have three spaces, which means I can kind of separate out different things in different areas. This is at the moment a bit more of a kind of meeting room, but I guess this is the stuff which I traditionally did. I started off doing paintings and these sorts of doing portraits mostly, painted in oil. These are some recent experiments using 3D scanning. Where we're kind of trying to confuse the scanner to produce results that look more like paintings than sharp and precise or high-tech sort of 3D scans, and that's proving to be quite interesting. I hope you can hear me okay. This piece, some of you might have seen, was when I used the VR technology, tilt brush, combined it with 3D scanning, which I did in a light stage. And with help from Pangolin addition to a foundry. So it was the first time that anyone managed to take a thing that had been drawn in VR effectively and realize it in bronze. And we managed to get it done just in time for the opening of an exhibition at the Royal Academy a couple of years ago. I'm afraid it is a big self-portrait. There was a good intellectual reason for that. It wasn't just narcissism. At least mostly nuts. Okay. So let's get out to, and now we'll head out to my painting studio, where I'm going to introduce you to the other panelists today. It's raining, of course, first time in months. Welcome, and this is my little painting space. So in my day job, when I'm painting people, they tend to sit in this part of the room where I can manipulate the lighting and create a sort of kind of sense of drama in people's faces. Paint around this part of the room on the whole, and you can see probably a few sort of finished or mostly half-finished paintings kicking around. Obviously, that's normally what's going on here. Occasionally literally kicking around when we walk into things. Okay, so I'm going to now try and do something I haven't done before, which is switch cameras, or rather the clever CogX people are going to do that. So hopefully this might work. If you can still hear me, because I'm going to introduce, I obviously wasn't completely confident of my own technical expertise, so I've invited two very brilliant artists, friends of mine, who really do know their shit, to contribute to this. Patrick, who's below on my screen, I don't think he's the same for everyone, but is I think we connected over a mutual interest in using virtuality and immersive technology to create art. And quite quickly sort of became interested in some wider topics, because Patrick's been, I think, exploring immersive technology, but also AI, and worked with sort of fashion world as well as the art world. I think you've done all kinds of things. I won't get you the CV quite right, but you've worked with V&A, with Gucci, with the ballet, with all kinds of people. So brings a whole breadth of knowledge, which is very new to me. And Scott Eaton, who I've met, I think we met last year when I happened upon an exhibition of his, which was using AI and GANs in particular in a extraordinarily impressive and exciting way. It's the first time I really got excited about seeing AI being deployed in art. And then quite quickly, several friends of mine, including one or two mutual friends, said, "Have you seen what Scott's doing?" So there was a sort of synchronicity there. I think even if I hadn't wandered into a show, we'd have probably ended up talking anyway. And so I think between us, there's kind of like, obviously we've got a bit, that's a broad interest in this sort of like overlap between art and technology. So just very, very quickly, because I can't get, rather than trying to waffle on too much, I just wanted to quickly to like give, if you guys would give a snapshot of what you've been working on during lockdown, Patrick.
So I've been, well, you probably know, over the last 2 or 3 years, I was working with the V&A. We were developing, and I've spoken to you about it quite a few times, Johnny, about how AI is going to impact artists as a collaborator. And I'm trying to see how the practice of a creative will become more of a polymath, and sort of you'll be crossing over between working with the AI, or you're going to be working with machine learning, and seeing if that collaboration is going to develop your work into a new realm. And really experimenting quite a lot. I've used Tilt Brush. I've been using lots of immersive tech. And I've kind of been speaking to the fashion world as well, speaking to blockchain, speaking to Deutsche Bank, Condé Nast. So it is kind of a person who did art. Then I went back to education a little bit, and now I'm playing more and more. It's kind of a playground at the moment, and I think you would know, Johnny, and even yourself, Scott. You're both experimenting as much as me. So I hope that gives you a quick overview.
You make me feel bad for having done so little during the lockdown. And Scott, are you still doing? Are you continuing your work on the same in the same direction as before, or have you been doing anything different recently?
It's a bit of both, really. It's combined. I've been working. I've actually been doing a lot of photogrammetry. Actually, I have just a huge kind of backlog of data that I've been trying to process and work through. The goal is both for visual output, so 3D scans essentially of figures. So I've been processing those throughout lockdown. The goal for both to make reference for artists, kind of these sculptural figures that can rotate in space, but also to inform, to build a data set. So that's the extension, is to make a big data set to train more machine learning models on. So it's a lot of experimentation. Because, I mean, as you guys know, like, these technologies are quite open-ended, and so it's experiments, tests, and failures. And
for the benefit of people who haven't seen your work or maybe don't know this area, do you have a little example of how it works, what your input is and what the output is?
Yeah, well, so you can see behind me, actually, the pieces in the background were pieces from my show last summer. Both the sculptures and the large print were all generated by my machine learning model, but with my direction, right? So the focus of that work was to essentially build drawing interfaces into kind of this rich data set that I've curated, so that I could direct the machine learning models with my drawing. All right. So in each instance behind me, like, I would draw the silhouette and draw the internal structure of the sculptures, and the machine learning model that I trained has some notion of planes and abstraction, and so it ends up producing these really rich kind of forms, right? That I'm only directing from a very, very high level. And in the case of the kind of the big figurative work, Fall of the Damned, that was me drawing figures, and it was effectively rendering those. But all of that was based on the data set that I collected.
I don't know if it's is it technically possible for you to show us the literal, because I think the thing that was for me so mesmerizing was the fact you were giving it a two-dimensional input, sometimes just a few lines, and it was extrapolating that out into really believable 3D shapes.
So I have, this is pretty low tech, guys. I'm not going to switch or share screens, but I'm just going to hold up my iPad and I'll show you just some drawing time lapse. So essentially using the figurative kind of network, which does kind of bodies.
Which you basically trained on many thousands of photos of human bodies.
Yeah, so I effectively photographed a huge data set of models in the studio. And so as I'm drawing, it's continually evaluating the context from my outlines. And as soon as I start to fill in with my kind of, I guess my shorthand is a gray fill, it starts to interpret all the gray fill as actual body. And so here he's working over an underdrawing.
Yeah. Is
trying to evaluate the context for every stroke in that. And you'll see as it gets to the end, I start to erase lines because the internal lines of kind of the sketch really confuse it. And it does this really interesting kind of derived style of a kind of a quilted pattern. But as I erase the lines, it starts to realize the context of a shoulder or a hip or an elbow or a foot or a knee. So these are just a huge selection of whimsical studies that I would do every morning to test the machine learning models as they came off my computer, right? So I'd train kind of models overnight or throughout the week, and I would sample them every morning by doing a little drawing session and running the kind of the process through the network. And so
I mean, it's mesmerizing to me. Did it turn out as you expected? Because you must. I mean, it was quite an undertaking to, set out. How many images did you load up for the human body exploration?
How it started was I have a big reference library for me as an artist for a lot of my figurative work, drawing and sculpting, and that was just a bunch of photographs that I had sitting around. It was maybe 20,000, but it was very heterogeneous, and that was, but it was just as these technologies started to make their way, or these algorithms started to make their way out into the public. This was maybe 4 years ago. It was an algorithm called Pix-to-Pix, and it was doing like little postage stamp size things, like 256 by 256 pixel images. So not really kind of production ready, but I trained on that data set that I just had lying around, which was maybe 20,000 images. And it did some really interesting, it learned some really interesting and profound things like lighting, direction and occlusion, and cast shadows, things that artistically, is quite advanced to learn how, like, limb out in space casts a shadow on the floor. But it seemed to have learned that by looking at all the photographs. And so subsequent to that, I kind of was encouraged, so I stuck with it and started to curate a more specific data set, maybe 5,000 images per model. And then I started to photograph more and more models, so it was more of a diverse data set. And then so that I kind of have control over like body types, I guess, race, gender, that sort of thing. And so yeah, it's been a progression over a good couple of years, good few years.
And did you have any idea of where it would get to when you started? I mean, because it seems to me that one of the interesting things about AI is that very often you don't know where it's going to get to, and actually it's the unexpected things which turn out to be the most interesting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You don't like the most seasoned practitioners and researchers kind of understand AI is largely a black box. It's very hard to see inside what it's doing. Like, so you can establish the parameters of the model and the architecture and kind of dictate the inputs, but like in the spatial context, like artistically, like what it does in the space between, say, for example, like if I drew an exact photo or an exact outline of one of the models that was in the data set, it would reproduce that photographically. But the magical part is when you do something that's not like anything that it's seen. That's it trying to expand. It's the process of generalization, and it's called generalization in a neural network, where it is doing something that it hasn't seen or been trained on. And that's the magical unknown part for me, and that's what I just love to explore, because you know, those sculptures behind me, though, they were just trained on like cubes and spheres, whereas all it ever saw, its entire worldview, was just these very primitive shapes. And then you give it like curved sinusoidal lines, and it just does this amazing composition of intersecting planes, even though it's never seen a curved line.
Amazing.
So it's magical, and that's I think the promise for me of AI and machine learning as a creative tool or a creative collaborator is how I describe it a lot.
Thank you for explaining. I mean, I think it's a particularly interesting example of where you know, a sort of someone who's not going into this from a particular research or scientific or commercial point of view to achieve a specific result, but just doing it as a sort of aesthetic and kind of philosophical almost exploration, can find things which other people wouldn't necessarily even know to be looking for. Because this is something which I know has come up with in our conversations with both of you guys separately, is the sort of and maybe it's slightly self-justifying because we are very interested in it, but the idea that there's an interesting, I think, role for creative people and artists, particularly to use technology to play with it, break it perhaps, but to find things that can be done beyond what they were designed for. And I think this is a nice example of an area that's a sort of current one. Obviously, Patrick and I have both explored that with VR and other things as well. And obviously through history in a way, in different kinds of ways, I suppose. I mean, famously, Warhol would take commercial printing processes, i.e. screen printing, and turn it into an art medium by pushing it in directions that it hadn't been designed for. And despite initial sort of, I guess, wariness that he was just using something that was a bit kind of, cheap and everyday, actually showed how things can be sort of commandeered for different purposes. I mean, I guess, it's not quite the same analogy, but when, Galileo, took the technology that was actually the other way around in a sense, they're taking from artists who were glass blowing in Venice, and then, saw the potential to make lenses and therefore telescopes, and by extension, well, according to my friend Brian Cox, who I've discussed this with, particle physics is all stems, it can be traced back through that. So something that started off as a exploration by artisans leads to all kinds of things in the future. I guess, I mean, going back to your thing, Patrick, and I think you've been exploring this for a while. I think you've done something with the data around this, but and I think it interested me when you kind of brought up this idea of like AI not as merely a medium, as it were, which I feel is how it is for but Scott and I were thinking about it, but actually as a sort of a really useful digital assistant who might anticipate things that you would need and do them, have them ready, do things quicker than you could perhaps. I mean, is that what you meant by it, or were you thinking even more that it might sort of like be extended to do things that you might not have thought of before?
Well, I guess one of the things that we kind of spoke about is, and because my background has been in education, is thinking about this assistant, like how could they assist you and aid you, not only as someone to do the work, but maybe inform you. So like you have all this breadth of knowledge of history of art, and you could go back and, like when I was looking at Scott's work there, I was thinking of Da Vinci. Some younger artists or creative may not have all that knowledge, and they kind of think, okay, well, like we spoke, I'd like to have a David Hockney as an AI tutor to look at my work and maybe give me feedback, and then I could have Eduardo Palazzi, and he could look at the sculptures and give you feedback, and almost capturing people, as well as you could start putting in information and informing the AI to become a collaborator, a friend, a person who gives you critical feedback, and some feedback you might not like, but as we know, it's kind of you pick and choose what feedback's going to be good for you and what's going to be bad. But I always saw, when I first thought about AI, is less about what it could do for you, but how it could aid you and work along with you. And then we kind of got, well, maybe, like Scott sends off, here's some images, and make some images for me, and when I come back in the morning, it could have 20 canvases ready. We don't want to see it as laziness. We want to see it more as a pure collaboration. All artists we're not lazy. We're really curious. And I think that was one of the things we kept on coming back, is we're constantly scrabbling around, and we want to use this AI as this really creative friend. And I think that was where I was kind of getting to, when we've had many chats about it. So I think that was kind of the end result in my head.
It's interesting. I think that we're getting back to this idea of the fact that, and it's something I'm very conscious of when I'm making paintings, because you, in a way, you're playing several roles. You're part of it is ideas, and whether that's affected by what you're seeing, or what you're feeling, or other cultural references and experiences. There's the actual execution of the work, which in the case of, if you're doing a big painting, can be pretty time consuming. And even if you have a clear idea of where it's going to turn out, which I often don't. And then there's the sort of editorial aspect that, you kind of are making decisions about whether something's going well or not, whether you can enhance it as you go along, which works better than others. Do you want to change direction, that kind of thing? And I guess that I'm kind of trying to come around to this idea that it's not, as you say, just laziness, but where you could have it something which speeds up the part which is the most mechanical in a way. And is that a bad thing? Is the fact that maybe in the future people would need less and less of the actual traditional skills, for want of a better expression, because that could be assisted for them, be justified from the point of view that actually the ideas involved might become much more complex and interesting because someone's got more time to experiment in those ways?
Well, imagine, sorry, Scott, if you imagine Picasso, Basquiat and Warhol, one's working and the other one was deconstructing and taking apart. If you think of collaborative art where they work together, you could say, right, Johnny's going to do a painting, and then Scott could send in some data sets that disrupt your painting, and then you bring it back, and there could be a multitude of collaborations, and it brings you to a new realm of work. So there could be benefits. Depends on your conscience, how you feel as an artist. If you can step back and it's all down to the artist, how they feel. You've got David Hockney, who wants to have the role of painter, where Jeff Koons will say, I'm happy to let others paint. It's my idea. My idea is paramount. So it's how the artist feels.
Yeah, and it will exist on a spectrum, right? In the same way that it does now in that example, right? Jeff Koons and David Hockney. Like now we have the capability to send a 3D model to a CNC machine, and somewhere in Italy it will sit there and carve out with the 7-axis robot, Carrara marble, right? And you get this beautiful marble piece that was never touched by a hammer and chisel, but the intention of the artist is still the same, and they made all the decisions about the form, even if they did it in maybe they did it digitally, maybe they did it in clay and scanned it, but it gets transferred into marble. Is a modern time-saving device, right? And so there is always this space for technology to step in and assist, right? In what you said, Jonathan, the monotonous part of the process, or the more mechanical part of the process. And
on that, I mean, it could potentially take some of the danger out of graffiti and street art if you can send a drone off to sort of like spray paint the outside of the local council offices from the safety of your armchair at home. But maybe the art would kind of lack a certain kind of impact and context because of it. It may change the way we view things if we know that they might have been made in all kinds of different ways and the artist not being present. I mean, in a different way, my own recent experience during the lockdown of being forced to paint people's faces, doing portraits over Zoom and FaceTime, I found very interesting, because on the one hand, you do actually still have the intimacy that you would have, because if you're both you're not, there are other people around, you're both doing it in isolation, you're connecting, you're talking. So in some ways, it's better than just working from photographs, because you can see the animation, you can see how someone reacts, you get a sense of their sort of energy levels and personality and how they move. At the same time, I've really noticed that what you don't see is the sort of real shape of their face, and the fact that things that you pick up when you are obviously present. There's more going on than literally the sort of like outlines and the kind of like depiction, even though in theory taking something from a flat surface and applying it to another flat surface should be a straightforward translation. I wonder, I mean, do you think there are I don't know, I'm kind of particularly, I didn't mean to like interrupt your flows, Scott, sorry, but I think I was going to like knock it back to you on that sort of note and say, what of all these sort of potential tools that you're aware of that's emerging at the moment, do you think might be part of an artist's sort of like basic toolkit in 15 or 20 years time? Because I think we talked about it the other day, but I think 15, 20 years ago, when Photoshop was a new thing and mostly being used by photographers and people who were just getting particularly then when digital started, photography started emerging, most artists I know, I think, wouldn't have ever imagined that it would become such a sort of standard tool, almost any visual sphere you're in. I mean, you don't use it very much. Most of us know our way around, and if you need to do something to a photo, it's a very still kind of a handy thing to reach for. Other photo editing software is available. But do you know what I mean? I wonder if there's like some things emerging now that you guys are conscious of, the potential for, which will be, a very standard part of kind of, most artists' toolkits in the future.
Well, I'll take it to start.
Or what you wish there would be, if they're kind of like multiple options.
Yeah, no, I think the rules are going to be completely rewritten in like a 10-year horizon for how we make images. It's already happening. AI and machine learning is currently disrupting everything, even though it's still at a low level and the quality is low. Like in 10 years time, like we're going to have these big generative toolkits where, like you can make images of anything you want. Like in a lot of ways, even now you could there's models that exist where you could be like, make me a photograph of a small bird with a short beak and a red breast and black wings, and it will sit there and generate you as many variations as you want. So imagine that in 10 years time with 10 years of progress in GPU or compute and 10 years more progress in the algorithms. Like it's going to be kind of like this There to be like, it's going to be a creative grab bag, right? So you can ask the computer for inspiration. Is what I imagine is going to happen. You're going to be like, okay, inspire me, and maybe as the artist, you set the boundaries of that. But we're going to have to rethink what it is to what the artist's role is in making work, right? Because right now, a lot of being an artist is being a craftsman, right? Is being a painter, being able to paint, being able to draw, being able to sculpt, being able to construct, and that's always in the spectrum of making art, because art is a tangible thing. But at the very beginning of that process, there's the concept, the formulation, right? It is almost the Jeff Koons model. He's like, here's my idea, and then the knock-on effect is that is done. And so I think there's going to be this really crazy time visually. And so where that gets to as a tool set, I don't know, but it will be out there, and it will be making images for us like crazy.
For me, what I've been working on at the moment is we've been working with the Oculus Quest and using our hands more and eliminating tools. So where Photoshop, Unity, all them have thousands of tools, and someone like me and Johnny, as I know Johnny's probably similar to me, is once you get into the computer software, you get lost, and now you need a technician. Where one of the things I had been working on, or still working on, is how do you eliminate as much of the tool, like buttons and what you need to press, and can you use your hands and pick up brushes and have almost a virtual experience of how you could make and craft and sculpt by using your hands as tools. And that was something that I want to pursue and kind of bring back. Obviously we're talking about haptic feedback and things like that, but a lot of artists can get over that and kind of go, what do I want to create? And I know when John made his piece in Tilt Brush, he was making all the facets and shapes and working around images and being very playful and experimental. And I think in one way, we're going to have people eliminating tools and using technology to simplify, which we're seeing in most softwares. In other ways, they're going to use and make things more advanced. So like Scott, bringing in lots of data, bringing in lots of AI knowledge. And then I guess you'll have obviously painters, people who will reject software. But one of the things like at universities is the vocabulary is changing. So people like I didn't know what a physics engine was. That's now part of my vocabulary, talking about physics engines and cloth simulation. And, you know, imagine if we brought Picasso back, his curiosity when he did his light drawings. It'd be interesting to see him in VR and how he would interact with Tilt Brush as well. So I think it's down to the artists to set their own parameters, whether they want less. And I've heard on many of the talks about art and science cross-pollinating more. And I think if more scientists could cross over, you know, listening to Scott and all of his language could blow a lot of people out of the park that are painters. They'll go, oh, well, I know a lot about translucentness. And even John, when you were speaking and you were talking about the forms of the face, if everything becomes digital, that knowledge of how you paint is only because you've built up that whole encyclopedic mind of how form is made in a 3D form, rather, and you'll be questioning that. And you notice a lot of people go back to learn, like they go back to an old camera, 35mm, and they'll go, that's why that happens in Photoshop. So they're learning the techniques, they're learning the history again. So I wonder if people will go forwards and then they'll go, I wonder what it's like to pick up a brush. What's it like to mix oil paint? And you must do that rather than it coming out the tube. You say, no, let's work direct with pigment. The experience of painting becomes a whole ritual. And I think that's what's great about painting as well. And it will never go.
But I think that's really interesting. I mean, I find it. I feel some reassurance from what you were saying before about the idea that we will. And I think obviously you're right that there's a sort of human instinct to work with your hands. You know, the hand-eye coordination. We may not be using paint on canvas in the same way, but to have some involvement in that way, because I think that I find it mind-blowing what you were saying, Scott, and I've seen some of those explorations around speaking and then images appearing. But of course, you then get into the realms of, well, you've got to therefore be very precise about what you're describing to narrow down something if you need to be precise, and it may become linguistic skills rather than technical or kind of kind of physical precision, which dictates how precise or original the work is. So I think that's why I think that you're kind of the recent explores where you are also drawing is such a lovely thing, because it's there's the element of the sort of the physical and the immediate feedback you get from your eyes to your brain according to what you're doing. I think is something that's sort of really compelling. I think that's your other point, Scott, about simplification is very important as well, because I think that, and that may become even more so the wider our armory becomes of tools available. And yes, I lost many weeks getting my head around Unity, and it's enormous fun. But in the end, I sort of felt, well, I can't help thinking that this is going to be a lot easier in 5 years' time. So maybe I won't kind of spend too long on it now. And I think that the idea that we could manipulate these tools as easily as you could, if you're cutting away at a block of clay or moving charcoal around a piece of paper. That's, I think, what's not only very appealing from my point of view as a sort of kind of old-fashioned artist, but also I think that's what will widen the technology to a sort of a much bigger group of people. So I hope that those sort of tools that work in that way don't get superseded by ones that are so easy and effortless that you have to describe. Write me a short film about a bunch of artists who get lost on a road trip, and then you can go and have a nap and it's done when you get back.
And don't get me wrong, John. I don't want to replace artists. I think that I think the establishing the parameters or directing it, like the artist as a director, as a craftsman, is something that will be the new conversation. And for me, I've drawn since I was a child, right? I'm a very capable draftsman, and I love to draw. So that's why I've been working on interfaces where I can draw and dictate a larger thing than just a line.
Yeah.
To me, that's magical, right? It's like a superpower almost.
Yeah.
Like I'm sculpting with a line, and so I think all the tools that are going to kind of explode out the other end of this, they're going to exist on the same spectrum, from painting and charcoal all the way through to Photoshop and digital photography and photogrammetry and AI. Like, we haven't gotten rid of painting, even though like you could argue that photography just made it more expansive, the possibility of paint when in the early 20th century.
Also, just one of the things we were talking about the other day is like digital artifacts, so things that are found in the virtual space when you're doing photogrammetry and digitalizing things. And one thing I guess artists are doing is they're rifting off digital tools or digital art to inform them. So you might see painters going, I like the way that brush works in Photoshop. Maybe I'm going to emulate that in a painting. So you're seeing Christopher Wall, you're even seeing you, John, using this sort of artifacting, almost anti-aliasing, which wasn't a word, and only from people using Photoshop or digitalizing stuff. You're now bringing that into your gamut of how you're painting. And it's been kind of part of your workflow anyway for the last, God knows how many years, is kind of destructing, putting it back. And now you're puzzling together in your pictures these little artifacts. And I think that's what, so artists are not only maybe just bringing it in, but they're also like stealing, which is also another Picasso thing we talk about, is learning to steal from people. And I think you're stealing from the digital world. You're becoming here, I'm a digital pirate, and I'm grabbing the work and it's informing how I paint. and we're seeing it a lot in your. And I think that's what's quite nice is you're becoming an agile painter who's moving around. And I guess, look, here's one in the background now. Here's one we made earlier.
Here's one I made earlier. I think this is the thing you're referring to, which is a bunch of work which was interesting to me because it was, these are things made by a kind of like sort of basically using this sort of scanner on the iPhones and glitching it, the early version of the software. And the ones that were most interesting to me were the ones that look more like paintings than scans. And I didn't really think of it in those terms at the time, but of course, what's interesting is that I did a whole load of them, a year and a half ago or whatever it was, and I tried to do some again recently. And of course, the software's been updated, and now it tends to get it right. It doesn't make the same mistakes. So it was the moment in time when the technology was trying to do something, getting it wrong, which made it more interesting in a way. And I think there's a sort of some fun in that the sort of, kind of the staging posts to where technology get to may also throw up interesting things for artists, sometimes more than when it's all kind of everything's sort of like, seemingly perfect and in minutely detailed and fully rendered. So I think that certainly that's an area that I'd like to explore a bit more. And I did a few of those at the time. I rather wish I'd done more now. I'm reminded actually of a conversation very quickly when I was showing David Hockney the VR for the first time, and we tried Tilt Brush, and actually he didn't take to it straight away. Although it's partly because I found out afterwards he's claustrophobic and didn't like the fact that he couldn't see the way out and couldn't see his hands. But I remember him mentioning, and I said we had lunch afterwards, and I said I thought you'd be interested in this stuff because of your obviously long-term interest in technology, and in particular the iPad drawings which he was famously doing and exhibiting around the world. And he said, and he cursed and said that he was the fact that he'd tried to do them recently, and they'd updated the software and taken away some of the tools that he liked on the app, the brushes or whatever the app was he used. And so he had his assistants going around on eBay trying to buy up old iPads with that software on that hadn't been updated so he could carry on using it. And I just like that sort of idea of like artists, not quite knowing how to deal with the sort of way things evolve. I dare say the kind of developer might have been able to share with him the previous version if they'd known. But I think there's something interesting there about where technology can be used before it fully gets to where it's going. Anyway, sorry to kind of waffle. I'm conscious that we're sort of like coming to the end of our timings for this initial session. If anything either of you want to say, otherwise I think we're going to take a little break and come back for a Q&A, I think in 15 minutes.
Yep.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. It's a great honor and privilege to have such enormous minds and talents here in the building or our respective buildings. So feel free to send in questions. I'll try and pretend I've done this sort of thing before. Obviously, I haven't.
Thank you so much, guys. This was incredible.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.